Can you really live on the UK state pension in 2026? Well, that's the question that I want to answer today. If you look at the figures, you might think, okay, pensioners are doing okay. The full UK pension has increased significantly over the last 10 years, but there's a problem. The amount of money that increase can buy, the amount of money in your bank account is not the whole story. What really matters is what the money can actually buy you. And there's a significant difference between pensioners that own their own homes and pensioners that rent. So today I'm going to look at four things. First, I'm going to look at how the pension compares with wages over the last 10 years. Secondly, whether pensions incomes have really kept up with the cost of living. Thirdly, how many pensioners own their own homes compared to renters? And finally, the big one, what happens if you're a pensioner and you're still paying rent? Okay, let's go back 10 years to 2016. In April 2016, the full rate of the state pension was £155.65 a week. The Office of National Statistics, I will abbreviate that to ONS, puts an average weekly earning at roughly £495 a week. So really the full state pension was equivalent to roughly about 31 pence of the average weekly earnings. Now in 2026, the full state pension is £241.30 a week, and the ONS average weekly earnings is £753 a week. That includes bonuses. That means that the full UK pension is now roughly 32% of average weekly wages. So it's kind of similar to 10 years ago. So what's happened? The state pensions increased by about 55% since 2016, whereas average weekly earnings have increased by about 52% over the comparable period. So if we take this particular comparison, the state pension has actually risen faster than average earnings. That's an important point because sometimes we hear pensioners' incomes haven't increased. Well, the full state pension has increased and it's increased considerably. However, not every pensioner receives the full state pension. The actual state pension depends upon your national insurance records and for some people their pension arrangements, their previous pension arrangements. So when I say £241.30, I'm talking about the full state pension, not necessarily what every pensioner receives. That's an increase of around £85.65 a week over the last 10 years, or shall we say more than £4,450 a year before tax. Sounds pretty good. But now we need to ask the more important question. What happened to the cost of living? Between April 2016 and April 2026, the Consumers Price Index in the UK has increased from 100.2 to 142.1. That's an increase of about 41.8%. So if we put the numbers side by side, average weekly earnings have risen by about 52%. The full state pension has risen by 55%, and consumer prices have gone up by 42%. Just looking at those figures, it suggests that the full state pension has kept ahead of inflation over this 10-year period. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the state pension triple lock. So the state pension is increased each year by whichever is the highest of growth, price inflation, or 2.5%. So technically, if we look at those figures, the full state pension has done quite well. But here's where I think the statistics don't tell the whole story. Your personal cost of living is not necessarily the same as the national inflation rate. If you're spending a large proportion of your income on food, heating, and housing, what happens to those costs matters much more than the headline inflation rate. So a pensioner can quite reasonably say, sure, my pension's gone up, but my bills have gone up as well. All right, now let's look at something that can make a massive difference on a retiree's finances: housing. If you're a pensioner who owns your home outright, you don't have to find money every month for rent or a mortgage. Okay, you still have to pay for council tax, energy bills, water, food, insurance, maintenance, transport, and other costs of everyday life. But accommodation, rent, or mortgage payment is a large portion of people's outgoings, and that can make an enormous difference. In research into the 2023 pensioner cost of living payment, 78% of pensioners owned their own homes outright, and another 4% owned their homes, but they still had a outstanding mortgage to pay. So 82% of pensioners were homeowners. And there's another important point. Owning your own home doesn't necessarily mean you're wealthy. You can own a property worth hundreds of thousands of pounds and still have a relatively low monthly income. I mean, you can't eat your house. You can't pay the electricity bills with the value of your property. You can't pay for transport with the value of your property. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that every pensioner homeowner is financially comfortable. But having no rent or mortgage can make a huge difference to the monthly budget. And that brings me to the group I think we need to talk about much more: pensioners that rent. Think about this. Imagine you're a single pensioner and you're receiving the full state pension, UK state pension of £241.30 a week. That's roughly around £1,046 a month before you take into account any taxation. Now, imagine you're renting privately. Suddenly, a significant chunk of your income can disappear even before you've put food on the table. That's not just a theory, obviously. The English Housing Survey for 2023-2024 found that retired private renters were spending on average 38% of their income on rent. Compare that with retired owner-occupiers who had mortgage costs, where the figure was only around 18%. That's more than double. And the average private renter aged 75 or over was still paying a mean weekly rent of around £190. Think about that. The full state pension is £241.30 a week. So if they're paying £191 a week in rent, that leaves only £51 a week from the pension, and that's the full pension before paying for food, electricity, gas, water, council tax, telephone bill, clothing, transport, and everything else. Now, obviously, many pensioners receive housing benefit, pension credit, or other support, and some live in social housing where rents are substantially lower. I mean, in London in particular, a one bedroom flat in social housing will probably be around about £130 a week, but that's still a significant portion of your £241 a week. This is where the phrase "I can live on the state pension" doesn't have one simple answer. It depends enormously on your housing situation. Two pensioners, two very different retirements. Let's imagine pensioner number one owns their home outright. They receive the full state pension. They might also have a small private pension as well. Their main expenses would be food, energy, council tax, water, and everyday pension. Pensioner number two receives exactly the same state pension, but they're renting privately. Suddenly their financial situation is completely different. Same state pension, different housing costs, different standards of living. And that's why I think we need to stop talking about pensioners as if we're all in the same financial position. There are pensioners with substantial private pensions. There are pensioners living mainly on the state pension. There are homeowners, there are social housing tenants, there are private tenants. And there are people who have savings and people who have very little savings at all. So the question isn't simply, has the state pension gone up? The better question is, after you've paid for your housing and essential bills, how much money do you actually have left? So, what can pensioners do? If you're living on the state pension, there are a few things worth checking. First, check whether you can receive pension credit. Don't assume you're not entitled to it. If you don't ask, you won't get. Second, check whether you're entitled to help with your council tax. Third, if you're renting, check whether you qualify for housing support. And look at your household bills: energy, broadband, insurance, water, food. Even small savings can make a difference when you're living on a fixed income. And don't forget, there are also concessions available to older people, including cheaper or free travel, depending upon where you live. The important thing is to check what you're entitled to, because if you spent decades paying into the system, claiming support that you're legally entitled to isn't something that you should feel embarrassed about. So, after looking at these figures, what's my conclusion? Well, the numbers tell us something quite interesting. Since 2016, the full state pension has increased by around 55%. Average weekly earnings have increased by around 52%. And the consumer's price index has increased by around 42%. So on paper, the full state pension has actually increased faster than general inflation. But that doesn't mean every pensioner feels better off, because housing changes everything. If you own your home outright, your pension has to cover your everyday living costs. If you're renting privately, a large portion of that same pension can disappear on rent before you even buy your groceries. And that's the real issue. It's not just how much money comes into your account, it's how much you have left after the essential bills have been paid. So now I want to hear from you guys. Do you think the state pension has kept up with the cost of living over the last 10 years? And if you're retired, are you a homeowner, a social housing tenant, or a private renter? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video useful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time, people.